Well, welcome everybody, and thank you AAAS for the invitation, and thank you Teresa for organizing this. I was saying that we are in for a very special treat. This is a great group of panelists for this topic particularly. My name is Samir Goswami. I'm with the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. We are a San Francisco-based nonprofit organization that brings together the tech industry with civil society organizations and academic researchers to focus on some of the most pressing challenges, but also the opportunities around artificial intelligence to make sure that AI is in net for the benefit of people in society. Today we're going to have a discussion around opportunities and risks and operationalizing good practices on AI and human rights. And we're going to talk about questions around how might AI technology be best utilized for human rights causes. We're going to talk about how we embed privacy and civil rights concerns into the technology itself. And what is the critical role that diversity plays in design and application, and many much more questions that we're going to explore with our esteemed panelists. With that, I'm going to do a quick introduction of all of our panelists in no particular order, and then pose a few questions to them individually, and obviously anyone can jump in. And then we're going to hopefully have some time for all of you to ask questions as well. And we're going to, of course, start with all of you just giving a 1 or 2 minute opening on what you do and why you're here. So I'm going to first start with Dr. Nadia Bliss, and she is the Executive Director of Global Security Initiative at Arizona State University. She has a PhD in Applied Mathematics from ASU, which, among many other accomplishments, explains why she's on this panel and speaking about AI. She's also a member of the graduate faculty in the School of Computing, Informatics, and Decision Systems Engineering, and is a senior sustainability scientist with the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Thank you for taking the time on this. Secondly, towards the end is Shabnam Mojtahidi, and she's a senior program manager at Benetech. She's a lawyer focused on rule of law and human rights, particularly in the MENA region. And at Benetech, she is leading efforts to apply AI to help civil society organizations pursue justice and accountability in Syria and beyond. And I want to read a quote that she said in one of her blogs, where justice is a hard-won battle fought by victim communities and human rights advocates, and technology will not overcome human-imposed hurdles, but it is a critical tool for amplifying the impact of human rights work. I look forward to digging into that a bit more with you today on this panel. Next, sitting next to Shabnam is Jennifer Ding, and she is a solutions engineer at Numina. She's an engineer by training with a master's from Cornell and a bachelor's from Rice University, and was also the founder and CEO of Parkit, which is a technology startup that utilized a computer vision system for collecting real-time parking data. And I also want to read another quote from one of your blogs that I read. And Jennifer has said that we believe that companies deploying sensors in public spaces have a responsibility to develop security and privacy best practices, not as a retrofit, but from the initial design. Looking forward to digging into that with you today. And then lastly, but not leastly, is Chloe Audio, and she's a policy manager at Intel. And Chloe specializes in issues related to AI and privacy and helps shape Intel's policies and advocacy globally. Chloe focuses on creating best practices for the responsible and inclusive design and deployment of emerging tech. She's also a champion of the critical link between diversity and the design of equitable AI systems, which is something of great interest to PAI and our community as well. So thank you for bringing those perspectives. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. And Nadia, if you'd like to just start with a minute or two about your work and the work of your institute.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So while my PhD is in applied math, I identify as a computer scientist. I spend my master's and bachelor's are in computer science, and I've been a practicing computer scientist for a while, though like a mathy one. One of the things, so I've spent the last close to 20 years working broadly in developing research initiatives and applying them in security context. So this includes national security, but also things like human security and just security more broadly. One of the other hats I wear is I'm on the executive committee of the Computing Community Consortium. There's some representatives here today, Dr. Ann Drobnis and Professor Dan Lopresti, and together we've been partnering with some organizations on identifying ways to leverage artificial intelligence to combat modern slavery and human trafficking. And I look forward to talking more about that a little bit later.
Thank you. Let's move on to Chloe.
Sure. Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today, and thanks to Samir and everyone else that put hard work into this panel and conference. I am neither a technologist nor a lawyer, but work in Intel's policy group at the intersection of both of those groups. Like Samir said, I focus on AI and privacy policy worldwide. Maybe a little bit about Intel and our AI efforts. As obviously many of you know and is relevant to this discussion, technology and business is changing in a lot of ways. And as more and more companies are working with data and working on more projects involving software and algorithms, particularly at Intel, we're doing a lot more work customizing our hardware for AI workloads. And so I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of our technologists and business units, leads, strategists, and lawyers working behind the scenes to develop those relationships from a policy standpoint and on the technology, the tech perspective too. So I've spent the last couple of years sort of being a participant in a lot of multi-stakeholder discussions, and it's been a fascinating experience in the world of AI. So really excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Ding. My background is in computer vision and machine learning, particularly applications in cities and the public realm. I'm currently an engineer at Numina. Numina is a company that develops a proprietary sensor that's purpose-built for streets. We believe that real-time data can help cities be more responsive and build more equitably for all citizens. But we also think that while there are benefits that tech can bring, it's really important how this tech is built. And our two philosophies are intelligence without surveillance and privacy by design, which is something that we apply from the hardware, the sensor level, all the way to our software, and also just a mission that we as a team embody. So I'll be talking more about how we apply those values as a tech company.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for PAI for putting this on, Samir, and AAAS for having us all here today. I am with Benetech. We are a tech for social good nonprofit, and I'm specifically working in the human rights program. So what we're doing in human rights is supporting human rights defenders to build software and use responsible tech to make their work more effective, more efficient, and safer. So that's really our philosophy around working directly with communities to identify needs and implement those needs. And I'm specifically working on a project around leveraging artificial intelligence methods to assist human rights actors, justice actors in the Syrian context. As many of you are aware, because it's been the news for many years now, there has been just a huge amount of data coming out of the Syrian conflict, posted to social media and circulating among human rights organizations. And as opposed to in the past, where the challenge has always been, how do we extract information from conflict zones? How do we get information coming out of hard to reach places? The challenge in this context has been, how do we make sense out of everything that's been collected, where we're dealing with organizations that are low resourced and have few staff on hand to analyze and assess everything that's been documented. So that's some of the challenges we're addressing right now at Benetech.
Great. Thank you very much for those introductions. Jennifer, I think we're going to dive right in and start with you. You mentioned one of your principles is intelligence without surveillance. How do you build and maintain privacy-forward systems, and how do you bake that into your design?
Yeah, I think Numina, our company, can just be one example of how tech can be built in a privacy-first way. The way it has been built so far is not inevitable. there's this kind of idea in the tech space right now that collecting all data that's possible, or using data to target for advertising or tracking is just the natural direction of things, but that is definitely something we don't believe. And so from the start, our approach to designing our sensor has been to do it in this privacy-first way. And from the Harvard level, we use a camera as a sensor. And we are aware that cameras, there's a great value that image data offers, but it is also potentially one of the most risky forms of data. And so our sensor actually has a processing unit inside, so all the processing of the imagery happens on the device. And then the next layer, the software layer, we choose to only collect anonymous movement data. So the main thing that we're measuring for cities are how different kinds of objects move in streets. This is typically done to collect data on safety, to reduce pedestrian and bicycle fatalities or quality of life, to understand how people are using public space. And we recognize that these goals can be achieved with anonymous data. We don't need to collect all the imagery. We don't need every single piece of data. In fact, that's a liability. That's a privacy risk. And so by building our systems in this way from the hardware and software level, we think that we can kind of be the gatekeepers of what data is available in the public realm, and make sure that we can provide this valuable real-time data without risking citizen privacy or having huge data loads that are a risk for data misuse by either hackers, third parties, or whoever may be able to access the data.
And just a quick follow-up on that. So internally, this is a commitment that obviously your executives have and you have, and is that what it takes to have that, or is there some other market forces that reward you for this level of thinking and this commitment?
It started as an internal mission, definitely something our entire team believes in. As engineers, we see the risks that are present, when these values aren't in organizations, but there definitely are market benefits. So for example, a lot of camera systems deployed in our cities today, they stream video back to the cloud or wherever this data is being stored and processed, and that's actually a very expensive task. To use cellular networks to stream video 24/7. So it actually is a much more scalable and affordable approach for us to just send our anonymous data. And also now that there's a lot of conversation and regulation around certain kinds of algorithms like facial recognition, for example, or San Francisco's stop secret surveillance ban, I think our approach will benefit us in the long run in terms of the cities that trust us and that we work with.
Great, thank you. Chloe, we're going to move to you since we're in DC and you're one of the policy people on the panel. There's lots of conversation, obviously, in our capital and other capital cities around the world around surveillance and privacy. How do you engage with that, with policymakers and with the interests of your business?
Yeah, so I think that first I'll just pile on a little bit of what Jennifer said. From an industry point of view, privacy is a really good thing. Maybe people didn't used to think about it that way, but if you're wanting people to use more technology, you want to engender trust in the technology that people are interacting with. And so I think we've sort of seen a shift, not only among policymakers, and I'll get to that later in terms of privacy being something that we need action around, but from industry and technology too. Privacy is a good thing. We want people to trust the technologies that they use, and we believe that at Intel. We've believed and we've been very public about the fact that privacy is a fundamental human right, and we've been pushing actually very, very strong for the last year or so to pass a comprehensive federal privacy law. The United States does not have a federal comprehensive privacy law whatsoever, and so a lot of my work in the last year or so has been, helping write that bill, helping shop it around with, advocacy groups, other companies, academics, privacy thought leaders, privacy experts, But I think what's been really most important and what I'm most excited about is the fact that now policymakers are very interested in this issue too. And here in DC, 5 years ago, colleagues of mine would, and who used to work at the Department of Commerce would bring this topic up to members of Congress and say, hey, let's talk about privacy. And they said, but after numerous scandals and data misuse, just like Jennifer was referring to, it's an important topic, and we'll continue to call upon Congress to pass a bill. And I'm excited about that. We'll just say that. But there's been a lot of activity here, and I hope it continues.
Thank you. Nadia, we're going to move to you, and I want to focus us back on some particular applications of AI. And your work is also a lot on anti-human trafficking initiatives that you do in partnership with quite a few different stakeholders, and many of those stakeholders may have different incentives or different approaches or even different constituencies. So can you tell us a little bit about your work with particularly the Technology Against Trafficking Coalition and how AI is helping in this issue? Probably not solving the issue, but helping with the issue. And what do some of those conversations look like with those multiple stakeholders?
Sure. Before that, I'm sort of really interested in this notion of that privacy increasingly is becoming a core value, and I just want to commend AAAS for this explicit opt-in, opt-out thing. I mean, it seems like a very simple, minor thing, but the fact that you can actually decide if you want to be photographed or not, I think is a really nice thing.
I don't think speakers have that option. But.
Yeah, I know, but I still appreciate it broadly. Mine's blue, so I'm okay. So one of the things that I just want to preface this a bit is I want to be very careful. I am not a human trafficking expert. I am a technology expert, and sort of how to apply technology in various security environments, and also making sure that the right technology transitions to the right applications. I think some of the things that you mentioned, there's an element of hubris that technologists have that, math is hard, computer science is hard, so we feel like if we've made it okay through that, we can make it okay through everything. And I think that hasn't gotten us to a particularly great place. That said, so one of the efforts that myself and Professor Lepresti and Dr. Drobnis have been involved in over the last year or so is working very closely with UN University and Rights Lab and Tech Against Trafficking and the Turing Institute on essentially building a network of actors to address the Target 8.7 goal of eliminating modern slavery by 2025. So there's multiple initiatives. There's a Delta 8.7, which is focused on making sure that we have the right data about the state of modern trafficking. Code 8.7, which has been sort of a follow-on initiative, which has been this partnership, brings together human trafficking experts with experts in computer science and artificial intelligence and machine learning. And one of the things that I see is there's a ton of positive opportunity to apply technology to human trafficking. For example, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit where we can use secure databases to connect disparate data sets across different people that are trying to mitigate it. We can also develop tools and deploy tools to identify drivers and pathways to mitigate the use of illicit supply chains. There can also be predictive decision-making environments. With that, of course, come significant risks. And I think one of the things that I've really appreciated about Code 8.7 is that explicitly brings in Annie Cannon's and the Survivor Alliance into this discussion from the beginning, so they're part of Code 8.7. And we think about things like of how do we have the stakeholders with domain expertise participate in this partnership. The other thing that I would say as a computer scientist, one of the things that I've struggled with is most of us in the research community have been aware of a lot of these vulnerabilities, but we haven't really had a culture of being vocal about vulnerabilities. It's really been about developing the next capability, and I think one of the things I appreciate about this discussion is there's a clear shift.
And I think you mentioned Annie Cannons, and it's a nonprofit that trains survivors of human trafficking to code.
Yes.
So you have both
Yes.
the technical expertise, but also the subject matter lived experience. that
Well,
serves in.
and not only that, as I don't know if people are aware of this, technology has a significant diversity issue, and of all types. So I think
gonna get
this
into
is right. So I think that's also a nice aspect of it.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I believe in your partnership. There's technologists, technology companies, there's subject matter experts and engineers and computer scientists like yourself, and then survivors. There's also law enforcement, from what I understand.
So through partnerships.
Through partnerships.
Right. So certainly we've worked in some of our ASU efforts with local law enforcement around Phoenix and Vegas, and the Turing Institute also works in the UK with their local law enforcement.
And they have different views on privacy, especially in the use of surveillance technology as well. So how does that get balanced in moving the process forward and applying the technology?
Wow, I think we only have an hour for the whole thing. So I guess the way that I would kind of frame that question is I actually think that a lot of the times the regulations around governments, at least in the US, have much more restrictive policies on privacy and data sharing than a lot of the technology industry in the US at present time. So I think that's actually an interesting both challenge and an opportunity to see where there is ability to learn from those two different communities.
Yeah, it sounds like even within law enforcement, different cultural approaches, depending on where you are.
Yes.
As well. Sticking to the theme of concrete applications on human rights, Shabnam, I'd like to turn it over to you. And your organization has built tech tools for nonprofits for almost 2 decades, I believe, over 15 years or so. And you yourself have worked in the field on human rights abuses in Syria. Can you tell us a little bit about the application of AI in your day-to-day work, but then also, if you want to speak broadly to how do you select which tools are appropriate to be used in a human rights context?
Sure. So Benetech has been working supporting human rights defenders to document and monitor human rights situations all over the world and do so securely. So that has been a long-running theme at Benetech. More recently, we've been thinking about, okay, now that so much documentation has been collected, how do we make the connections among pieces of data across dispersed organizations that normally wouldn't share with each other? So I think twofold, increasing efficiencies in analysis of human rights documentation, and two, increasing collaboration in a secure way. So the tool that we've been developing is processing videos and images to create unique fingerprints that can't then be reverse engineered using machine learning and computer vision techniques. And so that's actually creating a fingerprint based on the content of the video itself, and then matching those fingerprints across the fingerprint index and giving you a distance measurement for how closely related those two videos are. And then at the same time doing some very basic object recognition. So I think in the human rights space, there's a lot of concerns around data security and data sharing. And our hope is that by getting at the problem from this angle, we're able to overcome some of those obstacles, so that investigators can gain insights across organizations without those organizations necessarily having to share the data itself. I think in the human rights space, the application of AI is quite tricky. You're dealing with organizations that are quite low resourced and maybe don't even have basic tech infrastructure to begin with. And then going in and saying, okay, now let's use AI. You're going from almost zero to something very advanced and cutting edge. And I think that's quite that's where the challenge lies, right? You don't want to kind of parachute in and provide a tech solution where it can't necessarily be used or applied. And so a lot of the development of the tools that we're creating and a lot of our engagement, from the very beginning, speaking to those groups and speaking to those future users of these applications to gain insights on how they would be able to use it, how this would fit into their workflows, and what are some of the opportunities and risks involved. That's where kind of we have those conversations around what are the needs, and then also speaking to folks who are, we've developed strategic partnerships with around what are the risks, and where can we have the most impact and minimize the risks. And I think that's where kind of this deduplication application, provides a lot of impact in this space, and doesn't really expose personally identifiable information. And so I think the question here is, there have been requests, right? I think investigators would like to pursue facial recognition technology because it enables their investigations to identify perpetrators. I mean, this would be really useful for them. And so being approached with that question and then having to go back, speak internally, speak with human rights stakeholders, and speak with experts around, can we do this ethically? And if the answer is no, then that's not something we're going to be pursuing. And so I think having those conversations early on, and I think being, a human rights organization ourselves and being embedded in the community really enables us to do that.
Can I actually follow up on that? So I really actually want to emphasize something Shabnam said. One of the things that I think is incredibly important is there's absolutely no reason for a bunch of computer science researchers to be involved in a particular human rights violation or event. That's not the appropriate point to engage. So I actually think that's incredibly important to emphasize. It's kind of talking to that broad hubris in general. We're not going to come in and solve the problems of today with research. That's actually one of the things that I really appreciated about the Code 8.7 Alliance, that there's a focus on both identifying mature tech that maybe necessarily might not even be AI, but mature tech that can be leveraged today, but then also developing a long-term research roadmap informed by the stakeholders that have had the relevant experience. And I just think I really appreciate that point. So thank you for making that.
Great, well, thank you, and thank you for that addition. I think kind of sticking with that theme of who should be involved on the solution design state. Chloe, I want to turn to you. And Intel has done a lot of work around operationalizing a human rights framework, from what I understand. And one thing that's very important to the partnership is this notion of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and who the developers are, and then how that translates into a product that respects human rights or civil rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've operationalized that within your company?
Yeah, so Intel has a lot of things that we've done. We've published a corporate social responsibility report for 20 years. It's now become an industry best practice. But beyond, commitments to not using conflict minerals, to having a responsible supply chain, to environmental responsibility, one of our greatest, I think, commitments, and some of the work I'm most proud of personally, is our work in diversity and inclusion, and really making commitments to achieving full representation in our workforces, so having all of the candidates available represented in our workforce internally. And I think another element that I'm particularly proud of is our commitment to transparency, not just on our human rights and responsible processes as a company and as a manufacturer, but in terms of being open and honest about the data about our employees that we can share. I think a couple of days ago, actually, we just committed publicly to releasing information on pay gaps globally. So pay gaps based on race and gender, not just global diversity statistics about how many women and underrepresented minorities we have working at the company. This is something that companies don't do, and specifically tech companies don't do. I mean, it's no secret that there is a huge diversity problem in the tech industry, and my hope is that, by releasing these statistics about pay, across gender and race, that, we can start working with fellow travelers to achieve equity. But, back to your point, and I think where we're going with this question about diversity, it's not just important to have diversity because diversity matters. Diversity helps us build better products. It helps us make technology less biased. And beyond having diversity in gender and race and socioeconomic status, I think one thing that we've really practiced at Intel and that I've had the fortune to be a part of is working on teams building AI products that include anthropologists, ethnographers, social scientists, ethicists. So these people being able to bring their background of experience and their wealth of experience to actually design better products and make sure that data sets are more inclusive. So I'm proud of that work, and I hope it continues. But it's definitely something that the tech industry needs to continue to reckon with because lack of diversity is a problem, not just for companies and the way that they are perceived, but also for the technologies that they're building and producing.
Great, thank you, and thank you for kind of broadening our thinking on diversity as well. And kind of in that theme, Jennifer, I think a two-pronged question. One is I want to pick your brain on this capability versus security mindset that we've talked about, and I'd like for you to expand on that. But kind of going on what Chloe was saying, you partner a lot with city governments, but I'm assuming also with community organizations who are like, why is there a camera on a pole in my neighborhood, and what's it being used for? Can you tell us about some of those delicate negotiations and some of those guarantees that you give to communities who may not be very familiar with how the tech works, and how you represent them in your own design?
For sure. Something we definitely realize is because of the space we work in, which is public spaces in cities, the level of transparency that we need to have, we think, is much greater. And so part of that for us is transparency. So putting our practices, our privacy policy, but also just very clear statements of what we do and don't do. For example, we don't collect PII, so we won't detect license plates. We won't track individuals. In fact, our sensors are all decentralized, so we can't even track a single person between sensors. We think being very explicit about that is very important. Something that, another angle on this is we're seeing a lot of companies developing privacy policies now kind of in the context of their customers, so maybe in terms of consumer protection or maybe with their employees. And these are great steps, but especially for companies like ours that are working in the public realm, there isn't necessarily a way for people to opt out, right? So if you pass by a camera, you can't opt out of not being seen by it in the way that you might be able to opt out of some sort of interaction on the internet. So for these reasons, we think that it's important that these privacy policies and frameworks also consider impacts on the public at large, not just the consumer or the employee or people within the organization of a company.
Great, thank you. That's an interesting risk that has to be very delicately explained and managed and thought about. Shubnam, kind of in that vein, again, from one of your blogs, I want to read a quote and have you respond to it. The AI software that will make human rights abuse monitoring more efficient will also be used by governments for surveillance. The same social media platforms allowing human rights advocates to share stories are also being used by bad actors for disinformation campaigns. How do you go about mitigating these risks at Benetech, and particularly with the very sensitive communities that you work with? And I guess one broader question to that is, do you ever say no? Like, there's a great technology that could absolutely help in your the human rights work that you're doing, but it could have some consequences, or it could prove to be a capability that could be misused later.
Yeah, I love to say no. Yeah, I think there's the risks of, okay, well, I think it's going to be really rare that technology we develop isn't already in the hands of governments and large corporations. Like the human rights community is not going to be the first one getting like an emerging tech. So I think, and in terms of developing something, and you know, we're unlikely to be the first ones to do it. But I think it is because we are working in the human rights space, and because we're working, you know, putting everything out there open source, there are those considerations of like how do you mitigate those risks early on. And so yes, like saying no, I think one of the risks is that the technology you're developing is bad or could be used for more bad than good. And so, you know, I think I talked about that a little bit around, yeah, we've been asked to do facial recognition stuff, and we say, no, that's not something. I mean, I think if it gets into the realm of personally identifiable information, that's kind of where we would be skeptical of moving forward, or at least, you know, have a lot of those conversations early on. And I think, you know, there's this other idea around data responsibility. And just to build on what you said, Jennifer, I think this is a really tricky issue in the international justice and human rights space. And there's been a lot of work and thinking around informed consent when you're doing victim interviews and when you're engaging with victims. There has not been that sort of discussion and writing and like best practices around informed consent when you're dealing with digital data. So you have, I mean, I talked about the video. So everyone had smartphones in Syria. They were filming what was happening around them. There was atrocities, bombs falling, victims, children, women running out of buildings, and they were being filmed, and they were being filmed by human rights activists, citizen journalists, and humanitarian actors, and then that information was being posted onto the internet, probably without their consent. And now we're using this information for pursuing justice and you know, all our good intentions, and then now for like developing AI systems and algorithms, and no one really knows that their data is being used this way. And so when you're, and so that opt-out, the idea of opt-out just it doesn't exist, and it's hard to imagine how. I'm not going to try to provide any solutions. I'm just saying that there's no real thinking around this in this space yet, because I think it is quite complicated. And then I think another issue is to be, you know, developing solutions. I think one of the risks that I think we need to think about more if we're working on tech is that every time we're asking an organization to take on a new tech solution, even if we're providing it pro bono and we're doing everything ourselves, it's still taking time and resources, and their focus is, their mandate is addressing gross human rights violations. And so being mindful about how we're asking them to contribute to these things, and being mindful of the time and resources it's going to take from them to move from one workflow to another. And then finally, just say really quickly, something that I think, again, I don't have a good answer for this, but you know, with the proliferation of like digital data on human rights violations, just making sure that we're still engaging with victims, and we're still engaging with the stakeholders on the ground, and not just going after like the low-hanging fruit, the things that are posted onto social media. That justice is very much a people problem. I mean, the solutions require people, the inputs require people, and just putting people at the heart of all of that.
Thank you. That was inspiring to hear. The reminder. And to that, and this will be the last question from me for this round. Nadia, kind of in that vein, something you said on our call a couple days ago was, you asked a question, how do you take really advanced technology and transition it to where it can be realistically applied? Would love to explore that strain of thought with you.
Sorry, I'm like increasingly getting more and more depressed as we go through this.
Yeah, turn this around.
Yeah, no, yeah, unlikely. I don't think a technologist is going to turn that around. I think it should be a policy expert or a human rights expert. So I think there's a couple very concrete points that I would like to make there. One, I do think that we have gotten into this state, which I do actually think is turning around, where we were so capability-centric and have not really been vulnerability-centric. So I think depending on different application domains, so understanding what particular space you're in, so in this case, we're talking about human rights and human trafficking. Understanding the specific vulnerabilities of those spaces is incredibly important. So the type of domain expertise that we're seeing on this panel, I think is absolutely necessary at all stages of development of advanced technology. So one of the things that I was thinking about as we're having this discussion, it makes me wonder if human rights stakeholders, practitioners, domain experts were involved in early stage technology development if the technology that was developed wasn't so vulnerable to abuses. And my hope is that we're at this moment where, I would say historically, 20 years ago we were creating the internet and we were all like, yay, the internet, and now everything is broken, in my opinion. I just want to preface that with my opinion. I think we're or punctuated, I think we're in a similar place with artificial intelligence. I think we have an opportunity to develop technologies that could be helpful and useful in human rights situations and not expose or make vulnerable populations more vulnerable if we choose to inform that development early on. So the short answer to your question, the best thing I could say about technology transition is engaging stakeholders early and continuously, and not just at the end once something is ready.
Thank you. That's a wise lesson learned, and we see it every day in our work where
And everything's broken.
bringing all the stakeholders together that need to be at the table in a very genuine way with a lot of diversity considerations in mind, which my personal background is in business and human rights, and we did that afterwards. Like we built stuff and then we talked about human rights, and now, at least in some spaces with AI, we're talking about civil rights and privacy, et cetera, before we deploy something. I knew we were going to run out of time, so we only have about 10 or so minutes for audience questions, 15 or so minutes. So I think you have to line up and at the microphones. I am going to ask, given the sentiment up here, to try to keep it positive. Maybe if you can take us in a positive direction, that would be very much appreciated. And please also, I think, direct your question to one of us up here, to one of our panelists up here. And if you keep it as a question, that'd be great as well.
Yeah, and if you could please identify yourself too, and yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
You've talked a lot about the question that I'm going to ask, but you haven't talked about it directly. Could you share some insight on data ownership and how that's being determined?
That's a great question. Who would like to take that on?
So I can just talk about that really quickly, and then I think maybe, I don't want to, enlist anyone, but Shawna, maybe you could add a few comments, or even Jen with your data anonymization. I think it's something that everyone is really grappling with. Like I said, across the United States, in the United States, nobody has privacy protection as a right. It's not there's no expectation of privacy. You've heard these comments about privacy is dead, and to some extent, I personally agree with that. But in terms of data ownership, like I said, I'm not a technologist, and Intel, unlike other large tech companies that do a lot with consumer data, which we don't in the same way, it's a really tough question, and I can only offer my half enthusiasm on top of Nadia's pessimism to say that I really, really hope that we figure it out, and that getting a federal privacy law is, I think, the bare minimum and first step to making that happen. So that's my 2 cents from the maybe more positive policy point of view. Thanks.
I think that puts us at quarter enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Jennifer, do you want to tackle that? Because you actually built that into your systems.
Yeah, data ownership, I think, is a big part of the question. I would say that I think data usage is another important part of that question, but to address the ownership aspect, there's a big push in cities for open data these days, right, which is very inspiring. In New York, I think open data is actually a law, and a lot of public data is just available. I think as a company, we think it is important that the data that we collect in communities is available to those communities. And we just released a public API sandbox of data from downtown Brooklyn, mostly for academics in the area that are interested in playing around with street-level data. So, I mean, from my perspective, we definitely agree that this data should be able to be used. Value should be able to be gained by the people the data is actually on. I think what I worry about sometimes in the conversations about data ownership is that damage can be done even if there is like co-ownership, or even if people are getting paid for their data, for example, which I know is a model that has been suggested. What happens, say, if you are co-owning it and after maybe you sell it, but then what happens next? Like, does that mean we also need to be accountable for what happens to the data after ownership transfers, or yeah.
Let's go over here, and please do identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Mindy Reiser. I'm trained as both a journalist and a sociologist, and I'm vice president of an NGO that works in peace building and conflict resolution. Shabnan, I was quite fascinated with what you're up to, and in principle, I like it. However, there are a whole nest of questions associated with it. We talked about due diligence and reaching out to one's clients early and ongoingly. Now, there are a lot of people that are embedded in the work of the human rights organizations, survivors, people undergoing all kinds of threats and fear for their lives. And I don't have a good sense of how their interest in having their own identities shared, or even important details of their travails pervaded in terms of larger audiences to know what's going on. I don't need to tell you that our president has highlighted fraudulent media, but it's certainly true that there are people in the human rights space that are deliberately intending to mystify, to obstruct, and to contort what is shared. And I'm really concerned about how what you're doing really probes the integrity of what you're sharing. In principle, it would be fine, but I think there's the wariness that must accompany what you're doing. And I'd also be appreciative of some for instances in what you've been sharing and how it has made a difference.
So I should say that Benetech isn't sharing anything and is not collecting anything, but more so working with human rights organizations who have collected data and video and images from the conflict. And what we're trying to do is just to cluster similar content. If you're working, I mean, just one organization that we're working with, for example, has collected 3 million videos from online sources and from the ground. Another organization has collected 800,000 videos. Now, you can imagine if you're an investigator trying to, preserve all of that information, put it in one place and archive it, and then build case files that going through the data and trying to remember, okay, I saw this video back here, these two videos are related. Oftentimes the metadata is messy or missing. It becomes an impossible task. So what we're really trying to do is automatically cluster that material. And so I think getting at the point of like the manipulation of videos, I think this could really get at the heart of that, because if you are clustering these videos together that have similar content, you can then start to triangulate and verify information and notice if there's going to be if there's been manipulation in the video, and that's really what an investigator would need to do to identify both exculpatory evidence as well as inculpatory evidence. So I think that's getting at that, and I would hope that I think in the for instance, that would be really valuable is if we're able to fingerprint, and again, this project is new and ongoing, if we're able to fingerprint the data of many different organizations and journalists, first responders, and the people who collected the original video, you could then trace back from what was posted online back to the original source in a way that you wouldn't be able to automatically in the past. So, having that original source video and the filmographer to be able to testify on what they saw and how they filmed it, I think would kind of also address some of the concerns.
Nadia, did you want to have some 4 instances around your work in anti-human trafficking, also very sensitive data being used, like arrest records and case data, et cetera? I don't know if you have any.
So I mean, it's an interesting question broadly in the human trafficking researchers that I've spoken to. There's a professor at Arizona State University, Dominique Rose-Sepowitz, who is not just a researcher but also a practitioner. She's a social worker. She works with sex trafficked folks. It's interesting that the stories that I've collected from her, it's almost the opposite, right? So she works specifically in the U.S. To identify and rehabilitate sex trafficked victims, and the information sharing is so poor that there aren't even databases shareable between cities in the Southwest. So are people even thinking about privacy of the data? It's not obvious to me that it's there at that point. So there are technology challenges, cross-referencing. So, which I think actually broadly illustrates the broad set of challenges in human rights cases, where there's this whole oscillation from like technology is going to solve everything to there's no technology at all. And how do we actually try to deploy things that are useful and relevant in particular applications?
We'll go to the right.
Hi, my name is Monica Meltis. I'm from Mexico City. I work at an NGO that do statistics for human rights. And my question is for Jennifer first. I wanted to ask, how do you make the city governments engage with like this type of projects, even when they are in other places, at least in Mexico, I know they are the first interested in having this data and in owning and using this data without any privacy concerns. And also I wanted to ask to Shabnam, if you can tell us a little bit about your experience trying to use technology that has these privacy settings from the design, even in places where there is like a very important gap on digital literacy, which is something we have a lot in Mexico. We work with enforced disappearances families, so they're basically willing to give like a lot of information in exchange of governments working with them. And in that specific context, it is hard to talk about informed consent or like digital dignity, which is something like, thank you.
Thank you for the question. So most of the users of our data platforms, et cetera, are urban planners, transportation planners. And actually what we solve for them is something that we didn't talk about today, which is that today when they collect data, engineers or interns go out with clickers and clipboards and manually count cars, bikes, pedestrians. And so the conversation with cities is more about how can we automate that process for you. Another part of that conversation is that today we build streets largely based on the data sets that we have, and they're mostly on cars, which is the reason that many of our cities look how they do. And so in terms of reducing traffic deaths, Vision Zero, improving quality of life for residents, that's most of the conversation we have. And then we find that the privacy aspect is something that we're often introducing to our city partners. There's a little bit of I guess, maybe education or knowledge sharing that needs to happen. It isn't necessarily the primary focus, but because we don't typically work with enforcement or law enforcement or public safety type groups, it hasn't really been as much of an issue because we're able to provide the data they really need.
I'm really glad you brought up the issue of digital literacy. I think someone asked me recently, something that they should fund around AI for human rights? Like, what do human rights organizations need? And I was like, well, first step, digital literacy. Like, just to understand, I think in the U.S. at least, I think there's increased recognition about how these things work and how data is being used, and I think there's still a big gap there, but maybe that recognition is increasing, and I don't think that necessarily translates to other parts of the world where governments might be adopting these tools to increase their surveillance methods and targeting of specific communities. So I think part of what I see my role as is, and I think Benetech historically, the tool has always just been, it hasn't been the focal point. The focal point has been on the trainings and mentorship to increase ability to use tech, understanding of tech, and I think in this project, understanding of what AI is and how these data privacy issues here in DC we're having lots of conversations around.
Can I actually add to that? There's a recent study that actually just came out from Oxford University on use of organized disinformation campaigns, and they identified that there were 70 countries that used organized disinformation campaigns for various political reasons, and most of them use those campaigns internally within countries, and then there's obviously a few countries that were called out explicitly that are using them to manipulate populations outside of their countries. So resonate with that point quite a bit.
Let's go to the left.
Sure. I'm Salil Tripathi from the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And two quick questions, actually. The first is probably for Chloe and Nadia, which is on unconscious biases in recruitment. You spoke in particular about diversity and inclusion. And I'm just wondering whether AI can eliminate that, because that's one of the mantras, right? That artificial intelligence can eliminate the biases at the recruitment stage. And the other thought occurred to me when our Mexican friend just asked you, Jennifer, the question on roads and so on. I mean, I come from India, and smart cities is a big thing. Modi loves it, and he's also the surveillance champion par excellence. So I wonder what advice would you give him?
So I'll go first, I guess. I would say no right now. AI is not being properly deployed or could help us eliminate unconscious bias in hiring. We've seen a lot of examples across many sectors where an AI algorithm has been deployed to help, some recruiter sift through resumes more quickly and has resulted in tremendous bias, based on gender, experience, race, you name it. So I'm going to go with very low confidence in folks folks, relying upon this technology to improve or expedite hiring processes. And, to avoid being a total pessimist again, I think there's room for development and or research in that area, but it's one of those spaces where, companies and researchers and, whatnot really need to proceed with caution, because there are obviously a lot of negative impacts that can result from those technologies being deployed too prematurely. Like I said, I'm no technologist, but I, live and exist in this space where I work with folks, and in my job, think about the negative impacts of technology and how we can mitigate those. But in terms of design and future deployment, I would default or refer to one of my more technologically apt colleagues.
So I agree. At the moment, certainly the answer is no. And I think it's quite simple. AI is biased. There's a misconception that because there are mathematical underpinnings, it's providing, like, algorithms can't possibly be biased. Well, that's BS. I'm sorry for my language, because most of these algorithms are they're approximating things, and they're what's currently being referred to as AI is basically a lot of techniques that are trained on data sets, and if data sets that they've seen are full of white and Asian men, they're going to predict that white and Asian men are going to do really well when hired. And that is just math, right? So the fact that we have skewed data sets and approximate algorithms with, at times, poor performance bounds pretty much guarantees bias in those systems.
I think just before, I'm sorry.
We got super sad again. I'm so sorry.
I feel it's my duty to say something positive.
Yes.
I think the positive take that I have on that is it's the recognition. Like, here you have it's the recognition that that's where the bias is. It's the data sets that are biased, and whatever you put in, that's what you're going to get out of it. So.
Well, and I would say, the other thing that I would say that is very positive is there's clearly a shift in the computer science community to recognizing the fact that algorithm bias is a thing. And it's now being studied, and there are research investments that are being made. So I am hopeful that there's an opportunity to change this. But I really don't like this misconception that it's math, so clearly it can't be biased. Right.
Jennifer, smart cities.
Yeah, I think I would just say to anyone using the term smart cities, whether it's a company or a political leader, I would ask smart for whom, and also who gets to define what smart is. I'm very inspired by this project in the city of Boston. I think it's called Beta Blocks, but the city is working with 3 communities to educate citizens on the kinds of smart city tech that are out there. They can choose what they want to pilot and where to put it, and then by the end of this collaboration between the tech companies, the city, and the citizens, they get to decide what stays and what doesn't. And just for the future of happy, safe, healthy, equitable cities, I think having citizens in that conversation is just incredibly important.
Thank you. She is very positive, and Prime Minister Modi can contact you directly. I think we'll go to the right.
Hi, my name is Jared. I'm a 4th-year Human Rights Studies major at the University of Dayton and work at the Human Rights Center there. Appreciate it. I caught the back end of this, so I apologize if you already talked about this. My question is, what role does AI play in supply chains, and thinking about how supply chains have become so complex that many times there are human rights implications into the actual creation of AI technology. Thinking specifically of the reports that have come out about slave labor going into the mineral extraction and mining of resources that are then used in iPhones and Macs, and the reports come out about Samsung factories and employees that have committed suicide or have been killed due to high exposure to toxic chemicals. So thinking about the supply chain and implications of this technology, and not just how it's being used for human rights, but what are the human rights implications of the technology itself as well.
I can start from the research perspective. So there are actually presently, I believe, initiatives funded by National Science Foundation on illicit supply chain detection. There is clearly recognition that some automation and algorithms can help identify and build some decision support around those supply chains. I would defer to my colleagues on the more practical aspects of this.
Yeah, I can say a couple of words. I don't do a lot in terms of our supply chain, but at the beginning of the panel, I, talked about some of Intel's commitments to corporate social responsibility, and I think that, something that most companies now are more wary of, especially in the technology industry, is having a responsible supply chain. And so for Intel, that's meant not using any conflict minerals, reinforcing our commitment to environmental sustainability, whatnot. But I will just say, I have no real knowledge about using AI for our supply chain, but I will just say that, I think supply chain and supply chain responsibility is a people and a policy issue, not an AI or technological issue. Committing to using responsible minerals or, not sourcing from conflict areas, these kinds of things are not necessarily, and maybe, other folks on the panel would disagree, but, I think from a corporate point of view, the first, the initial reaction would, I would hope at least, not be to try to apply AI to these situations, but rather think, hey, how can we improve our supply chain? How can we make it more secure? How can we make it more safe without, and starting, from people and who is involved, where these things are happening, rather than trying to deploy some kind of technology, kind of like Shabnam has said, with like parachuting it in. Like I said, supply chain is about people and issues, and not maybe something that a technological fix can solve.
I'll add just a minute to that. One of our partners at the Partnership on AI is a company called Samasource, and this is even new to me, but training data for AI, oftentimes there are these literal data farms where there are factories in Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, where there are people sitting in very large rooms that are tagging images. And that goes into training that a lot of companies, Fortune 500 companies, use. And they came to us thinking about, how do we make sure that those jobs, those AI jobs, are actually good jobs, and they're good wages, they're living wages, et cetera. And they've set some standards, and they're putting out some standards around making sure that AI jobs, AI supply chain jobs, are actually good jobs, because those will be some of the jobs of the future. And currently, there's also been some conversation amongst human rights groups of how do you use AI to collect massive amounts of data from various different sources about how workers are being treated in their workplaces. And that could be social media data, that could be audit reports, et cetera. As I say that out loud, you can also see a technology that can grab all that data, assess it, analyze it, make a prediction on it, can also be used to survey those workers to identify union organizers, for example. So there's two edges of the coin on that, where the technology could probably be deployed to find out what's happening at a factory or a mine, et cetera, but it could also be used by an illicit actor to figure out who's organizing the workers.
There's an element of scale there, right? So a machine learning algorithm is going to be much faster at looking at massive amounts of data. There was a Defense Advanced Research Project Agency project focused on detecting human trafficking that was reasonably effective, where it was able to identify patterns, leveraging human experts who could highlight the specific things to look for in various posts to be able to flag, again, privacy issues, surveillance issues, but the scale of data that was analyzed was significantly larger than a human expert could.
And I should add, and I'm going to violate my own don't be negative rule here. We've known about supply chain issues forever. We didn't even have to tell us that there are conflict minerals that are going into laptops. Right. But how much have we done about it? I think that's the impressive question. Last question goes to
Yeah, so thank you so much. I was going back to something that was said at the beginning of the panel that I thought was hopeful, but I didn't hear enough about the specifics. So I think, Chloe, you were saying at Intel, you've got new products that are designed by expertise using political scientists, anthropologists, human rights experts in the design, which sounds a lot like the kinds of things one would want to see from the start. What are those products and how are they different? Have you measured their difference in application and results in terms of the kinds of things that they respond to from a human rights perspective?
Yeah, so yes and no, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about this afterward. I mean, yes and no in terms of being able to talk about all of the products. But at Intel, our business has changed, or is changing. You know, fundamentally, we're a hardware company. We make chips. But the more that data and AI applications have become part of our general technology ecosystem, we are working more and more with, end user, customers and applications to optimize and customize further up the stack. So we're not just building, or supplying off-the-shelf hardware anymore. We're building drivers and tools. We're working on specific capabilities all up to the application deployment level. And so having the perspectives from social scientists, from ethnographers, from economists, I think helps the contextualize the deployment of some of those technologies in a way that, a data scientist or a programmer may not think about otherwise. So, for example, this is one thing I can say a few words about. We recently acquired the Israeli self-driving car company Mobileye, and but even before that acquisition, we had a lot of work in the business of self-driving cars. Building and using sensors to, similar with some of the work that Jennifer is doing, pick up street data to make those vehicles safer. We had one of our social scientist researchers, a fantastic woman who I am happy to call my colleague by the name of Heather Patterson, go to Pittsburgh and spend an extended amount of time there studying the deployment of various self-driving cars. And I'm actually not sure if it was our deployments or our fleet deployments there, but being on the ground, doing interviews, collecting a lot of qualitative data around what it really means to have technologies like these deployed and how people respond and react to them. What are the harms? What are the challenges? This kind of research and input that is not necessarily, that you can't have in the lab, So this is an example. I'm happy to talk about more, but I think it just reinforces the fact and the importance that having people like Heather and like the group of wonderful researchers that we have in an internal group we actually have called Intel Labs, who work with not only these technologists building specific products and working for customization, but also going to physical areas where new technologies are being deployed and studying how those technologies are received, and being able to provide that input in a more sort of in a positive feedback loop or a positive way to actually get the input that we need to make the best technologies that we possibly can. So again, happy to talk more about some of these different applications, but hopefully that provides some perspective on how valuable that diversity and experience really is when it comes to new tech.
If I can also add an example of sort of interdisciplinary work. Within my institute at Arizona State University, one of the areas that we work on quite a bit is disinformation, and we actually have an effort that's led by a person who is an expert in narrative theory, and so a social scientist, and understands how different narratives, particularly propaganda, are structured, and is able to leverage that very deep expertise working with computer scientists to identify, to basically build templates to identify disinformation in various cultural constructs, whether it's Russian disinformation or another part of the world. And I actually think that's a positive thing.
I was gonna
like,
say,
yay.
that is a positive.
Woohoo. Yes.
Using AI to fight disinformation. We're out of time, but I want to do a quick 30-second lightning round. to ask all the panelists in 30 seconds, what are you most excited and optimistic about when it comes to AI? You can count your finding disinformation.
Well, you know what? I actually think a positive thing is that we're having this conversation, right? I mean, I think this is an important discussion to have, and I think the fact that we're actually questioning the relevance and vulnerabilities and kind of the importance of the security mindset, and quite frankly, Jennifer really gives me hope, particularly not because you said that your company is built on this ethical principle, but because you said there's market-based incentive to be ethical, which ultimately is what's going to be sustainable and scalable in this environment. So I think that's reasonably positive. Yes. Yeah.
I'm proud of you, Nadia. So I'll keep it short and sweet. I've had the pleasure of working with so many women in this space, whether it's like standing up AI ethics programs and projects at different companies or in academia. I'm very proud and happy to see so many really, really awesome and fantastic women sort of leading this space. And big props to all the men out there who are joining us. And Samir, awesome. But in the, in terms of just having a focus and commitment to really trying to get this right across the industry and across academia and civil society, there's just been a great number of female colleagues I've had the pleasure to work with. And so if this panel is any example, I'm just very happy about that. So thanks.
So my inspirational thought is actually from a cynical point in this conversation. I think at some point we were talking about like, oh, human rights organizations won't be the first users of AI or the people developing AI. But then I was like, why not, right? Yeah, that really stuck with me. I remember reading about a UN pilot using blockchain for digital identity, which was really inspirational. And it just strikes me that a lot of the use cases that we talked about today are maybe some of the most extreme ones where, if we develop for this use case, then we will probably have covered a lot of potential problems, which maybe is a market solution as well, maybe. But I really liked that point about developing for vulnerability rather than capability. And yeah, I think that's just something I'll be thinking about. I think there's definitely an appetite in tech to work on problems like these, I think. And if we're able to aggregate talent, resources, and organizations that are already doing great work on these problems, like, who knows, maybe that could be, maybe human rights organizations could be the ones that are leading the development of certain kinds of AI, and maybe they should be.
I'm quite cynical, so I think this is a difficult question. I think I would echo what Nadia said, like having these conversations, but I'd love to see these conversations happening more in other parts of the country that maybe don't necessarily get to talk about these things all the time, and then other parts of the world as well. So echoing the digital literacy and the education around these issues.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thanks for talking about the opportunities. Thanks for talking about the risks. And thanks for turning it around into something positive. So I appreciate that. And thank you all of you for staying late for this conversation. And thank you again for Teresa.
Thank you.